The humid air of Rabaul hung thick over the harbor like a wet blanket, carrying with it the mingled scents of salt water, engine oil, and the distant sweetness of tropical flowers that lined the volcanic ridges overlooking Simpson Harbor. Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the transport ship Koyasumi Maru, his white-gloved hands clasped behind his back, watching the morning mist slowly lift from the turquoise waters. He had overseen 43 successful convoy operations in these waters, each one a testament to the superiority of Japanese naval coordination and the invincibility of their South Pacific stronghold. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The date was March 2nd, 1943, and the world was holding its breath. Yamamoto was not a tall man, but he carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who had spent 3 decades in service to the emperor. His uniform was immaculate despite the oppressive heat. Not a single wrinkle dared appear on the pressed fabric. At 52 years old, he had survived the brutal campaigns in Manchuria, witnessed the triumph at Pearl Harbor from his post in Tokyo, and now commanded the vital supply operations that kept Japan's conquered territories fed, armed, and operational. His face was weathered like ancient teak, each line a story of devotion and discipline. "Colonel, the morning reconnaissance reports no enemy activity within 200 miles, reported Lieutenant Koji Hasegawa, a young officer whose enthusiasm still hadn't been tempered by the harsh realities of prolonged warfare. Hasegawa's eyes sparkled with the confidence of youth, believing wholeheartedly in the narrative they'd all been fed, that American forces were demoralized, scattered, and incapable of mounting any significant offensive in this region. Yamamoto nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the horizon where 9 other ships formed a proud convoy line. The Koyasumi Maru was surrounded by destroyers Shikanami, Yuki and Asashio, each bristling with anti-aircraft guns and crewed by men who had trained relentlessly for exactly this kind of escort duty. The convoy carried critical supplies, ammunition, medical equipment, reinforcements, and food provisions, destined for the garrisons at La, where Japanese forces were struggling to maintain their grip against increasing Allied pressure. "The Americans have tried 12 times to disrupt our convoys in these waters," Yamamoto said, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of someone who had breathed too much smoke and salt air. 12 times they have failed. Their high-altitude bombing is inaccurate. Their torpedo attacks are predictable. They lack the courage and precision that our forces embody. What Colonel Yamamoto didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know as he stood there in his pressed uniform with the morning sun warming his shoulders, was that 500 miles to the southeast, a very different kind of American was waking up to a very different kind of mission. Captain Paul Mitchell stood beside his modified B-25 bomber at Port Moresby, running his hand along the smooth metal of the aircraft's nose. The plane didn't look like other B-25's anymore. Where there once had been a transparent bombardier's compartment, there was now solid metal. And mounted in that metal nose, pointing forward like the fingers of an angry god, were 8.50 caliber machine guns. Paul was 31 years old, with sandy hair that refused to stay in regulation despite repeated applications of pomade, and green eyes that had seen too many friends spiral into the ocean in flames. He had flown 47 combat missions, and each one had taught him the same bitter lesson. Conventional tactics weren't working. High-altitude bombing scattered ordnance across miles of ocean. Torpedoes were slow, gave defenders too much time to react, and required pilots to fly straight and level into walls of anti-aircraft fire. But this was different. "You really think this is going to work, Captain?" asked Sergeant Tommy Chen, the armorer who had spent 3 weeks helping install the forward-firing gun package. Tommy was a first-generation American, born to Chinese immigrants in San Francisco's Chinatown, and he possessed an engineer's mind that could visualize stress points and firing solutions like some men visualized baseball statistics. "It has to," Paul replied simply, his fingers tracing the cold metal where each gun barrel emerged from the nose. "We've lost too many good men flying the old way. Those ships have so much anti-aircraft fire that approaching from altitude or dropping torpedoes is it's suicide with extra steps." The concept was revolutionary in its brutal simplicity. Instead of dropping bombs from above or launching torpedoes from the side, they would come in low, dangerously low, just above the wave tops where radar struggled to track them. They would approach head-on, and at the last possible moment, all 8 guns would open fire simultaneously, raking the target ship from bow to stern with a devastating stream of .50 caliber rounds. Each gun fired 750 rounds per minute. 8 guns meant 6,000 rounds per minute, 100 bullets per second, all concentrated in a narrow cone of destruction. They called it skip bombing, combined with strafer modification. But the technique needed a better name, something that captured the terrifying inevitability of it. Major Jack Hardnose Henderson, the squadron commander, had simply called it Commerce Destruction Pacific Style. Paul's navigator, Lieutenant Sam Kowalski, emerged from the operations tent with a rolled map under his arm and a grim expression. Sam was a former mathematics teacher from Boston who had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. Leaving behind a wife and 2 young daughters he spoke about constantly. His hands always smelled faintly of the pipe tobacco. He refused to give up despite the tropical heat. "Just got the intercept reports," Sam said quietly, unrolling the map on the wing of the B-25. Japanese convoy departed Rabaul at 0400 hours, heading south-southeast toward La. 10 ships, transports, and destroyers. Intelligence estimates between 5,000 and 7,000 troops aboard, plus ammunition and supplies. Paul studied the map, his finger tracing the projected course of the convoy. The Bismarck Sea stretched out before them, a vast expanse of blue where men died quickly and often without anyone ever knowing their names. "If that convoy reaches La," Sam continued, "it'll reinforce the garrison there for months. Could extend the campaign by half a year. Maybe longer." "What's our flight time to intercept?" Paul asked. 2 hours, 40 minutes. "Weather's supposed to turn bad this afternoon. Storms rolling in from the west. We'll have maybe a 3-hour window." Paul looked up at the sky, where morning clouds were beginning to build into the towering cumulus formations that could hide an entire air fleet. Somewhere up there, other B-25's were being fueled and armed. Somewhere up there, the mathematics of war were being calculated in fuel loads and ammunition counts and the probable rate of survival. "Get the crews together," Paul said. "All of them. I want everyone to understand exactly what we're about to do." 30 minutes later, 13 crews stood in the sweltering heat outside the operations tent. These were men from everywhere, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from California who had traded textbooks for bomb sites. They stood in loose groups, some smoking, some silent, all waiting to hear about the mission that would either end the war in the Pacific or end them. Paul climbed onto an empty fuel drum so everyone could see him. "Gentlemen," he began, and the conversations died instantly. "In approximately 90 minutes, we're going to attempt something that's never been done before. We're going to sink an entire enemy convoy using a new tactical approach." He explained it then in clear and simple terms. The low approach, the forward guns, the terrifying necessity of flying straight toward enemy ships while they fired everything they had. He didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't pretend it would be easy. "The Japanese think they own these waters," Paul said, his voice carrying across the assembled crews. "They think their convoys are untouchable. They think we're too afraid, too inaccurate, too demoralized to stop them. Today, we're going to teach them a lesson in American innovation and pure, concentrated firepower." Back in the Bismarck Sea, Colonel Yamamoto had no inkling of the storm about to descend upon him. He stood on the bridge, sipping green tea from a ceramic cup that bore his family crest, a crane in flight over a mountain. The cup had survived the Manchurian campaign, the years in Tokyo, and now this posting in the South Pacific. It was a talisman, a piece of home in a war that had taken him far from everything familiar. Lieutenant Hasegawa appeared at his elbow again, this time with a weather report. "Sir, meteorology indicates possible storms this afternoon. Heavy cloud cover developing from the west." "Excellent," Yamamoto replied. "Cloud cover will protect us from any aerial reconnaissance. The Americans rely too heavily on their spotting planes. Without visibility, they cannot find us." But even as he spoke those confident words, the colonel felt something strange. A prickling at the back of his neck, an ancestral whisper that his grandmother would have called mushikwisu, the premonition of being watched by hungry ghosts. He dismissed it as fatigue and returned his attention to the convoy formation, watching the way the destroyers cut through the gentle swells with mathematical precision. On the deck below, Corporal Yuki Tanaka was writing a letter to his wife in Osaka. Yuki was 23 years old, married for less than a year before being conscripted, and he wrote every day without fail. His letters were filled with observations about the tropical birds, the strange fish in these southern waters, and his dreams of the small house they would build when the war ended. He never mentioned the fear, the constant anxiety of being a target, or the friends he had watched die in previous convoy attacks. "Do you think they'll really let us go home when the war ends?" asked Private First Class Hiro Matsuda, who sat nearby cleaning his rifle for the third time that morning. Hiro was 18, barely old enough to shave, and he cleaned his weapon obsessively because it gave him something to focus on besides the endless ocean and the growing understanding that he might never see Japan again. "Of course," Yuki replied with more certainty than he felt. "Victory is inevitable. The Emperor has declared it." The conversation faded into the gentle sounds of the ship, the creak of metal, the distant throb of engines, the cry of seabirds following the convoy in hopes of scraps from the galley. It was a peaceful morning, the kind that made war seem like a distant nightmare rather than an immediate reality. High above Port Moresby, the first B-25's were lifting off, their modified noses pointed toward destiny. Paul Mitchell's aircraft was third in the formation, climbing steadily through the humid air. In the cockpit, he went through his pre-combat checklist with the mechanical precision of ritual fuel mixture, prop pitch, gun charging handles, bomb release mechanisms. "All guns charged and ready," reported Staff Sergeant Mike O'Brien from the top turret position. Mike was a former Boston cop who had joined up after his brother died at Wake Island, and his voice carried the flat, measured tone of someone who had learned to manage fear through routine. The flight to the Bismarck Sea was 2 hours of tedium punctuated by occasional radio chatter and the constant drone of engines. Paul used the time to visualize the attack, the approach angle, the moment of gun engagement, the pull-out after the pass. He had practiced it 100 times in his mind, but imagination was always cleaner than reality. Reality included flak, tracer fire, the possibility of collision, and the screaming chaos of actual combat. Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto had not always been a military man, though anyone looking at him now, standing ramrod straight on the bridge with his medals gleaming in the tropical sun, would find that hard to believe. In his youth, he had been a painter, a student of traditional sumie ink painting in Kyoto. His father, a respected calligrapher, had hoped Takeshi would continue the family's artistic legacy, creating scrolls and screens for temples and wealthy patrons. But that was before the world changed, before Japan's rapid modernization demanded soldiers rather than artists, before the pressures of empire building required men who could read tactical maps better than poetry. The transition had been neither easy nor complete. Even now, at 52, Yamamoto still saw the world through an artist's eyes. The way morning light played across water reminded him of specific brush techniques, broad strokes for the horizon, delicate touches for the shimmer of reflected sun. The formation of ships in his convoy pleased him not just strategically but aesthetically, the geometry of their positioning creating patterns that would have made a beautiful woodblock print. "Sir, would you like more tea?" Lieutenant Hasegawa asked, appearing like a ghost at his elbow. Yamamoto glanced at his cup, surprised to find it empty. He handed it to the young lieutenant with a small nod. "Thank you, Hasegawa. Your attention to detail does you credit." The lieutenant beamed at the praise, filling the cup from a ceramic pot kept warm on a small brazier. Hasegawa was the son of a Colonel Yamamoto had served with in Manchuria, a brilliant tactician who had died leading a charge against Chinese positions. Taking care of the boy, mentoring him through his first command position, felt like a debt being repaid to a ghost. "Have you written to your mother this week?" Yamamoto asked, accepting the refilled cup. "Yes, sir. I told her about the successful convoy to Bougainville last month. She worries, as mothers do." "They should worry," Yamamoto said quietly. "War is not the glorious enterprise our propaganda suggests. It is mud and blood and good men dying for inches of territory that mean nothing to anyone except the generals who mark them on maps." Hasegawa looked shocked at this admission, his young face struggling to reconcile his commander's words with everything he had been taught at the military academy. "But we serve the Emperor," Hasegawa said carefully. "Our sacrifice has meaning because of that service." "Yes," Yamamoto agreed. Though his voice carried undertones the lieutenant was too inexperienced to catch. "We serve." The colonel's mind drifted back to a conversation he'd had with his wife, Akiko, before departing for this posting. They had been married for 28 years, a partnership that had survived his military career through sheer force of her patience and his devotion. Akiko was the daughter of a merchant, practical and unsentimental in a way that balanced his artistic nature. "You don't have to go," she had said that final morning in their small house in Tokyo, though both of them knew it wasn't true. "They've given me a command. To refuse would be reasonable," she interrupted, her hands folding carefully over the tea set she was packing away. "You've served for 30 years, Takeshi. You've given them your youth, your health, your peace of mind. When is it enough?" He had no answer then, and he had no answer now as he watched the convoy cut through the Pacific waters. When was it enough? When did duty transform from noble sacrifice into simple habit? When did the brush become a sword and the sword become everything? Below deck, Corporal Yuki Tanaka continued his letter to his wife, Hanako. His handwriting was careful and precise, each character formed with the attention to detail that had made him a successful clerk in civilian life. "My dearest Hanako, today the ocean is as smooth as the silk of your wedding kimono. I know you worry when my letters arrive slowly, but please understand that the postal service in these distant places is unreliable. I am well. I am safe. The other soldiers take care of me and I take care of them. We are like a family, though a family thrust together by circumstance rather than blood." He paused, chewing the end of his pen. How could he explain to her what this was really like? The constant fear that lived in his chest like a cold stone. The way every distant airplane sound made his heart race. The nightmares where he drowned in warm water that smelled like oil and death. "What are you writing?" asked Private Hiro Matsuda, who had finished his third weapon cleaning and was now restless with nervous energy. "Letter to my wife," Yuki replied. "You write every day. What do you even say?" "I tell her about the birds, about the water, about the way the sunset turns the clouds orange and purple. I tell her about the men I serve with, the food we eat, the small moments of beauty in this ugly situation." "You don't tell her about the scary parts?" Yuki looked at the young private, seeing in his face the fear that all of them carried but few acknowledged. "No," he said gently, "I don't tell her the scary parts. She has enough to worry about in Tokyo with the rationing and the air raid drills. I want her to imagine me in a place of sunshine and blue water, not in a place where death might arrive at any moment." Hiro nodded slowly. "I don't have anyone to write to. My parents died in the earthquake of 33. No wife, no girlfriend. Just the Emperor and the army." "Then write to your future self," Yuki suggested. "Write letters describing what you see and feel, and seal them away. When the war ends and you're an old man, you can read them and remember who you were when you were young and brave." The idea seemed to appeal to Hiro, who pulled out his own writing materials and began carefully composing his thoughts. His face screwed up in concentration. Meanwhile, 300 miles away and closing, Captain Paul Mitchell was dealing with his own ghosts. The flight over open ocean was hypnotic in its monotony. Endless blue below, endless blue above. The constant drone of engines creating a vibration that numbed the mind. Paul used the time to think, which was both a blessing and a curse. Thinking inevitably led to remembering, and remembering inevitably led to the faces of men who weren't coming back. Lieutenant Dave Hartman, killed 3 months ago when his B-25 took a direct flak hit over Bougainville. The plane had simply disintegrated, turning into a brief flower of orange flame that fell in pieces toward the ocean. No parachutes, no survivors, just there one moment and gone the next. Captain Rick Summers, who had survived 23 missions only to misjudge an approach during a torpedo run, flying too low, clipping a wave, and cartwheeling across the water in an explosion of spray and metal. Paul had been flying wing position and had watched the whole thing, helpless to do anything but mark the spot on his map and report it after the mission. Search and rescue found nothing but oil slicks and floating debris. First Lieutenant Bobby Torres, just 22 years old, married 3 weeks before shipping out. Bobby had been shot down by a Japanese Zero while returning from a mission, his damaged B-25 struggling to stay aloft. He'd ordered his crew to bail out, stayed with the plane to give them time, and rode it down into the jungle. They found the crash site 2 weeks later. Bobby was still in the pilot's seat, having never attempted to escape. These were the ghosts that flew with Paul on every mission, sitting in the empty spaces of the aircraft, whispering questions he couldn't answer. Did it hurt? Did they have time to be afraid? Did they think about home in those final seconds? "You okay, Captain?" Sam Kowalski's voice crackled over the intercom, pulling Paul back from the dark place his thoughts had wandered. "Yeah, Sam. Just thinking. Dangerous habit, thinking. I gave it up years ago. Much healthier to just fly the plane and let the brass do the strategizing." Paul smiled despite himself. Sam had a gift for cutting through the darkness with his dry Boston humor. It was one of the reasons Paul had requested him as navigator, not just because he was brilliant with maps and calculations, but because he made the horror bearable. "What do you think about when we're flying?" Paul asked. There was a pause before Sam answered. "I think about my daughters, Maggie and Beth. Maggie must be 7 now. Can you believe that? I missed her birthday last month. Beth is 5, and according to my wife's letters, she's decided she wants to be a pilot like her daddy. That's a good thing to think about. Yeah, better than thinking about what we're flying into. You see those clouds building ahead?" Paul refocused on the horizon where massive cumulus formations were stacking up like mountains in the sky. The convoy would be somewhere beyond that wall of clouds, and the weather would complicate an already dangerous mission. "I see them. How's our fuel?" "Good for another hour of flight time before we need to think about turning back." "But Paul, if this goes wrong, if the whole thing turns into a furball..." "I know, Sam. I know." What Sam didn't say, what neither of them wanted to acknowledge, was that this new tactic was completely untested in actual combat. They'd practiced the approach on abandoned merchant ships in training, but those ships hadn't been shooting back. Those ships hadn't been surrounded by destroyers bristling with anti-aircraft guns. The training had been one thing, this would be something else entirely. Behind Paul's aircraft, 11 other B-25's maintained formation, each one carrying crews with their own stories, their own fears, their own reasons for being here. There was Lieutenant Jimmy Chong, whose parents had been interned in California simply for being Japanese-American, and who flew every mission with the fury of someone who had everything to prove. There was Captain Mike Ironside Patterson, a former minor league baseball player who treated combat missions like ninth-inning rallies, always believing they could pull out a win. There was young Lieutenant Danny Morrison, who had lied about his age to enlist and was probably only 19 despite his personnel file claiming he was 22. Each of them was following Paul toward whatever waited beyond those clouds, trusting that this new weapon, this flying gun platform, would work the way they hoped, trusting that American ingenuity and raw firepower could overcome Japanese discipline and superior position. "Navigator to pilot," Sam's voice crackled again. 5 minutes to visual contact. Weather's going to make spotting difficult. Copy that. Turret, you awake back there? "Wide awake, Captain," Mike O'Brien replied from his position in the top turret. "Guns are ready. Nervous as a cat in a dog pound, but ready." Paul checked his own gun charging handles, feeling the satisfying clicks as each weapon cycled. 8 guns, all pointing forward. In a few minutes, he would find out if this entire concept was brilliant or suicidal. Back on the Kayasumi Maru, Colonel Yamamoto finished his second cup of tea and allowed himself a moment of contentment. The convoy was making excellent time. Weather was providing cover. In 12 hours, they would be approaching La, where the supplies they carried would strengthen Japanese positions for months to come. It was a small victory in a large war, but Yamamoto had learned to appreciate small victories. They were the only kind that lasted. "Colonel," a voice called out, and Yamamoto turned to find Ensign Takeo Kimura approaching from the communications station. Kimura was the youngest officer on the bridge, barely 21. with the smooth face of someone who had never needed to shave more than twice a week. Yes, Ensign. Sir. Radar is detecting some atmospheric disturbance to the south. Probably just the weather front moving in. But I thought you should know. Keep monitoring it, Yamamoto ordered. If it develops into anything significant, alert the destroyer captains. Kimura saluted and returned to his station, leaving Yamamoto alone with his thoughts and his tea. The colonel's mind drifted again, this time to his brother Kenji, who had died at Midway. Kenji had been a pilot, confident and skilled, certain of Japanese air superiority. His final letter had arrived 3 weeks after the battle, describing the beauty of flying at dawn, the way the aircraft felt like an extension of his body, the pride he felt serving the emperor. Then came the telegram. Then came the funeral with an empty coffin. Then came the quiet understanding that no amount of skill or courage could prevent death when death decided to arrive. Yamamoto had that feeling now, that death was deciding things. He couldn't explain it, couldn't justify it with logic or evidence, but it was there nonetheless, a cold certainty settling into his bones like winter frost. Sir, are you feeling well? Lieutenant Hasegawa asked, noticing the colonel's distraction. I'm fine, Yamamoto lied. Just tired. These long convoy operations take their toll. But it wasn't fatigue. It was the premonition that every soldier learns to recognize if they live long enough. The sense that something is about to break, that the careful order of things is about to dissolve into chaos. He looked out at the convoy, at the neat lines of ships cutting through gentle swells, at the destroyers maintaining their protective formation, at the clear sky above and the building clouds to the west. Everything was perfect. Everything was according to plan. And that, Yamamoto realized, was exactly when everything tended to fall apart. Yamamoto knew no help would arrive in time. Rabaul was 200 miles away. Even if they scrambled fighters immediately, the battle would be over before they arrived. The convoy would be at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea, and thousands of soldiers would be drowning in water that looked so deceptively beautiful from above. Another B-25 screamed past the bridge, its guns tearing into the Kayasumi Maru's stern section. The impact threw Yamamoto to the deck, his carefully pressed uniform now smudged with oil and blood, though whether the blood was his own or belonged to Ensign Kimura, who had been standing beside the window when it exploded inward, Yamamoto couldn't tell. Abandon ship preparations, he shouted, pulling himself upright using the chart table. Lieutenant Hasegawa, get the wounded to the lifeboats. But Hasegawa wasn't moving. The young lieutenant sat slumped against the bulkhead, his eyes wide and unseeing, a piece of shrapnel the size of a finger embedded in his throat. Blood pulsed weakly from the wound, each heartbeat pumping more of his life onto the deck. Yamamoto crawled to him, pressed his hand against the wound, felt the hot blood flowing between his fingers. Medic, he screamed. I need a medic on the bridge. Hasegawa's lips moved, forming soundless words. His hand reached up, grasped Yamamoto's wrist with surprising strength. The colonel leaned closer, trying to hear whatever final message the boy was attempting to deliver. Mother, Hasegawa whispered. Tell Mother, I served honorably. Then the light went out of his eyes, and his hand fell away, and Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto was holding the corpse of a boy he had promised to protect, in a battle he had never imagined losing, in a war that suddenly felt very different than it had that morning. Below deck, Corporal Yuki Tanaka was drowning. The strafing run that killed Lieutenant Hasegawa had also torn open the Kayasumi Maru's hull below the waterline. The Bismarck Sea poured into the lower decks with the force of a river, flooding compartments, trapping men in spaces that became coffins within seconds. Yuki had been thrown against a bulkhead when the ship listed violently to starboard, and now he was underwater, in darkness, his lungs burning as he clawed frantically for any surface, any pocket of air, any chance at survival. His hand struck something solid, a ladder rung. He pulled himself up, broke the surface, gasped desperately for air. The water was rising fast, already up to his chest, and the emergency lighting flickered weakly, casting nightmarish shadows across the flooding compartment. Help! Someone screamed in the darkness. I can't swim. Someone help me. It was Private Hiro Matsuda, the 18-year-old boy who cleaned his rifle obsessively and had no family to write letters to. Yuki could hear him thrashing in the water, panicking, going under. Every survival instinct told Yuki to climb, to get out, to save himself while there was still time. But he thought of Hanako, thought of the letter pressed against his heart, thought of the man he had promised her he would remain even in the midst of war. He let go of the ladder and swam toward Hiro's voice. "Grab my hand," Yuki shouted, reaching through the darkness. "Hiro, grab my hand." Their fingers connected, locked together. Yuki pulled the younger soldier toward the ladder, pushed him up toward the hatch above. "Climb. Don't look back. Just climb." Hiro climbed, his movements jerky with panic but gaining strength as he rose. Yuki followed, his own arms burning with effort, the water nipping at his heels like a living thing determined to drag him down. They burst through the hatch onto the main deck, gasping and coughing, just as another B-25 roared past, its guns tearing into the ship's superstructure. Men were running everywhere, some heading for lifeboats, others trying to man weapons that no longer worked, still others simply standing in shock, unable to process the speed and violence of their ship's destruction. "The lifeboats!" Yuki grabbed Hiro's arm. "We have to get to the lifeboats." They ran across the tilting deck, dodging debris and bodies and patches of burning oil. The ship was listing heavily now, her death throes obvious to anyone with eyes to see. Around them, the other vessels in the convoy were in similar or worse condition, burning, sinking, breaking apart under the relentless American assault. Captain Paul Mitchell pulled his B-25 into a steep climbing turn, gaining altitude for another attack run. His aircraft was riddled with holes from Japanese anti-aircraft fire, oil leaking from the port engine, hydraulic fluid streaming from damaged lines, but she was still flying, still fighting. "Damage report," he called over the intercom. "Port engine is running rough but stable," Sam Kowalski responded. "We've got holes in the right wing, the tail section, and something hit the bomb bay doors. Hydraulics are compromised but not failed. We can make one more pass, maybe two if we're lucky." "Mike, how's the ammunition?" From the top turret, Sergeant O'Brien's voice crackled back. "Forward guns are at about 40%. We burned through ammunition faster than expected, but we've still got enough for another solid strafing run." Paul surveyed the battle below. The Japanese convoy was devastated. Half the ships were already sinking or sunk, the others burning or crippled. But men were still dying down there, drowning in water mixed with oil and blood, and the mission called for maximum destruction of both ships and their cargoes. "All aircraft, this is Black Eagle Leader," Paul transmitted. "Reform on me for final attack runs. Target any vessels still showing signs of propulsion. Make every round count." The B-25's swept around for their final passes, their modified noses still smoking from previous attacks. They came in low again, wavetop height, and delivered the coup de grace to the Japanese convoy with the same mechanical efficiency they had demonstrated in the initial attack. Colonel Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the dying Kayasumi Maru, alone now except for corpses. The radio operator was dead, slumped over his equipment. The helmsman was dead, his hands still gripping the wheel. The junior officers were dead, scattered across the deck like discarded toys. Only Yamamoto remained, the artist-turned-soldier who had survived Manchuria and countless other battles, who had painted cherry blossoms in ink on rice paper before he learned to read tactical maps, who had a wife waiting in Tokyo and a collection of memories that would now die with him in these tropical waters. He thought about running for the lifeboats. He thought about abandoning ship, about survival, about seeing Akiko one more time. But he had spent 30 years teaching young officers about honor, about duty, about the code of Bushido that demanded a captain go down with his ship. How could he abandon those teachings now, at the moment of truth? Yamamoto walked to the bridge window, or what remained of it, and looked out at the carnage. The beautiful convoy formation he had admired that morning was now a graveyard of twisted metal and burning fuel. The ocean he had compared to silk was now choked with debris and drowning men. The perfect morning had become a perfect nightmare. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook and pen. His hands were steady as he wrote a final letter to Akiko, his handwriting as precise and careful as it had been when he was a student of calligraphy in Kyoto. My dearest wife, by the time you read this, I will have joined our ancestors. Please know that my final thoughts were of you, of our small house in Tokyo, of the cherry trees we planted together in the garden. Please know that I died serving as I lived, with discipline and dedication. Please know that I love you, have always loved you, and will wait for you on the other shore. Your devoted husband, Takeshi. He folded the letter carefully, placed it in a waterproof pouch, and tied the pouch to a piece of floating debris. Perhaps it would wash ashore somewhere. Perhaps someone would find it and honor a dead man's final wish to send words of love across the barrier between life and death. Then Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto stood at attention on his bridge, straightened his uniform one final time, and waited for the ocean to claim him. Corporal Yuki Tanaka and Private Hiro Matsuda made it to a lifeboat just as the Kayasumi Maru gave her final groan and began her descent to the ocean floor. They weren't alone. 30 other soldiers had crowded into the small boat, men covered in oil and blood and seawater, men who moments before had been confident in their Navy's superiority and were now survivors of something they still couldn't fully comprehend. "Row!" someone shouted. "Get clear of the ship. The suction will pull us down." They rowed with desperate strength, their oars churning the debris-filled water, pulling away from the sinking transport. Behind them, the Kayasumi Maru slipped beneath the surface with surprising grace, her bow lifting skyward for one final moment before she disappeared completely, leaving only bubbles and floating wreckage to mark where she had been. Yuki's hand went to his chest, feeling for the letter to Hanako. It was still there, soaked through but intact, the ink probably running but the paper itself surviving. He would make it home. He would deliver this letter himself. He would tell her about the men who died, about the ocean that became a graveyard, about the boy named Hiro who he saved because she had taught him that humanity mattered even in the midst of inhumanity. Around them, the Bismarck Sea was carpeted with survivors. Hundreds of men clinging to debris, floating in oil-slicked water, calling out for help that might never come. Some ships' lifeboats had survived and were picking up swimmers. Others were simply drifting, overcrowded and directionless, hoping that rescue would arrive before dehydration or exposure claimed them. In the sky above, the American B-25's had ceased their attacks. The convoy was destroyed, not damaged, not disrupted, but utterly annihilated. Every single ship had been sunk or was in the process of sinking. The mission that was supposed to reinforce La would never arrive. The supplies that were supposed to sustain Japanese forces for months were now scattered across miles of ocean floor. Captain Paul Mitchell turned his damaged B-25 toward Port Moresby, his hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline and the sustained violence of the attack. His aircraft shuddered with every adjustment to the controls, the damaged hydraulics making even simple maneuvers difficult. "Sam, give me a heading for home," he said quietly. "Course 270, Sam Kowalski responded, his voice equally subdued. "Estimate 1 hour 40 minutes flight time if we can maintain current speed." An hour and 40 minutes seemed like an eternity. Paul wanted nothing more than to be on the ground, to shut down the engines, to step away from the death and destruction and take a breath that didn't smell like cordite and blood. "You did good, Captain," Mike O'Brien said from the turret. "We all did good. That convoy would have killed a lot of Allied soldiers if it had reached La. We saved lives today." It was true, Paul knew. Every ship they had sunk, every Japanese soldier now floating in the Bismarck Sea, represented Allied lives saved in future battles. But the knowledge didn't make the victory feel clean. War never felt clean, no matter how justified, no matter how necessary. "Check the other aircraft," Paul ordered. "Get a count of who made it through." Sam worked the radio, calling each aircraft in sequence, confirming their status. The tally came back slowly, 11 aircraft responding, 1 missing. Lieutenant Danny Morrison's B-25 had taken a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire during the second attack wave. Multiple crews reported seeing it explode in mid-air, breaking apart and falling into the ocean in flaming pieces. No parachutes, no survivors. Danny Morrison, the 19-year-old kid who had lied about his age to fight for his country, would never see 20. His parents, who didn't even know their son was flying combat missions in the Pacific, would receive a telegram in a few days, and their world would shatter just as completely as Colonel Yamamoto's had. "Mark his last known position," Paul said softly. "Maybe search and rescue can." But he didn't finish the sentence. They all knew there was nothing to rescue. The flight back to Port Moresby passed in somber silence, each man alone with his thoughts, processing what they had just done and what it meant. They had proven a new form of warfare, validated a tactical innovation that would change the nature of the Pacific campaign. But the cost of that validation was measured in lives, American and Japanese both. When Paul's B-25 finally touched down on the runway at Port Moresby, he sat in the cockpit for a long moment after shutting down the engines, his hands still gripping the control yoke, his mind replaying the battle in fragments. The faces on the Japanese ship's deck, the way metal peeled away under .50 caliber fire, the splash patterns where men had jumped or fallen into the water. "Come on, Captain," Sam said gently. "Debriefing won't wait forever." Paul climbed out of the aircraft and stood on the tarmac, looking at the bullet holes that pocked his B-25's fuselage, the oil stains from the damaged engine, the hydraulic fluid pooled beneath the wings. The aircraft looked like it had been through a war, which of course it had. Major Jack, Hard-Nose Henderson, was waiting near the operations tent, his face unreadable. As Paul approached, the major lit a cigarette and offered one to Paul. "How bad?" Henderson asked. "Bad for them," Paul replied, accepting the cigarette even though he didn't usually smoke. 10 ships, all sunk or sinking. Estimate 5,000 casualties, give or take. "We lost Morrison and his crew." Henderson nodded slowly. "Intelligence is calling it the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. They're saying it's the most one-sided aerial victory of the war. They're saying you just changed everything about how we fight in the Pacific." "They're probably right," Paul said, taking a drag and immediately regretting it as the smoke burned his throat. "But it doesn't feel like victory. It just feels like necessary murder on an industrial scale. That's what war is, Captain, and you're better at it than most. Get cleaned up, get some food, and be at headquarters at 1,600 hours. The brass wants a full after-action report, and they're already talking about expanding the program. More aircraft, more modifications, more missions." Paul crushed out the cigarette and walked toward his quarters, his legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. Behind him, ground crews were already swarming over the damaged B-25's, assessing repairs, counting bullet holes, preparing the aircraft for their next mission. Because there would be a next mission, and another after that, and another after that until either Japan surrendered or everyone was dead. 3 days later, Japanese search planes found the survivors of the convoy floating in the Bismarck Sea. Corporal Yuki Tanaka was pulled from a lifeboat, severely dehydrated but alive. Private Hiro Matsuda was beside him, unconscious but breathing. Of the approximately 7,000 men who had sailed from Rabaul, fewer than 800 survived. The letter Yuki had written to his wife Hanako was still pressed against his chest, the ink smeared and barely legible but the sentiment intact. He would complete the letter later, adding a postscript about survival and sacrifice and the thin line between life and death. Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto's body was never recovered. Neither was the letter he had written to his wife Akiko. But the waterproof pouch he had tied to debris was found 3 months later by a native fisherman off the coast of New Britain. The fisherman, not understanding Japanese but recognizing the importance of a military letter, delivered it to Australian forces, who eventually ensured it reached Tokyo. Akiko Yamamoto received her husband's final letter in August 1943, 5 months after his death. She read it once, then carefully placed it in a box with all his other letters, his old paintings, his medals and commendations, and the ceramic teacup that had somehow been shipped home with his personal effects. She never remarried. She tended the cherry trees in their garden until her death in 1978, and local stories said she could sometimes be seen at sunset, talking quietly to the trees as if her husband were still there, listening from the other shore. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became a turning point in the Pacific War, though not in the dramatic, immediate way that some battles do. Its significance lay not in territory captured or strategic positions secured, but in what it represented, the moment American forces stopped reacting to Japanese tactics and started dictating the terms of engagement. Captain Paul Mitchell flew 23 more combat missions before being rotated back to the United States in December 1943. He never fully adjusted to the hero's welcome, never quite understood why people wanted to shake his hand and buy him drinks when all he could think about were the faces on that Japanese transport ship's deck, frozen in his memory at the moment before his guns opened fire. He married a nurse named Catherine Williams in 1945, had 3 children, and never spoke about the war except once, to his oldest son, who asked what it had been like. "It was necessary," Paul said. "But necessary isn't the same as good. Remember that." He died in 1987, surrounded by family, his final words a quiet apology to men whose names he had never known, in a language he had never spoken, for doing what war had demanded. Sam Kowalski survived the war and returned to Boston, where he resumed teaching mathematics at his old high school. His daughters Maggie and Beth grew up hearing stories about their father's adventures as a navigator, though Sam always edited out the parts where people died. He lived to see both daughters graduate college, marry, and give him 6 grandchildren who called him Papa Sam and thought he was the wisest man in the world. Lieutenant Hiro Matsuda recovered from his ordeal in the Bismarck Sea and spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner camp in Australia, where he learned English, discovered a talent for poetry, and decided that if he survived, he would dedicate his life to peace rather than war. After repatriation to Japan in 1946, he became a teacher, then a principal, then an advocate for reconciliation between former enemies. He died in 2001, having touched thousands of lives with his message that humanity transcends nationality. Corporal Yuki Tanaka made it home to Tokyo in 1944, medically discharged after his near drowning left him with persistent respiratory problems. He reunited with Hanako, gave her the water-stained letter, and they rebuilt their lives in a Japan that was slowly being destroyed by American firebombing. They survived the war, barely, and spent the next 50 years running a small bookshop in the rebuilt city. The letter he wrote on the Kayasumi Maru hung framed in their bedroom until Yuki's death in 1995. A reminder that love persists even when everything else fails. The B-25's with their 8-gun noses became standard throughout the Pacific, their devastating effectiveness against shipping forcing Japan to route supplies by submarine or abandon isolated garrisons entirely. The tactic Paul Mitchell and his crews pioneered was studied, refined, and replicated, saving countless Allied lives at the cost of Japanese shipping that Japan could not replace. By war's end, the concept had evolved into an entire doctrine of low-level attack aviation that influenced military thinking for generations. But on quiet nights, in veterans' halls and memory-haunted bedrooms across America and Japan and Australia, old men who had been young once would wake from dreams of diving aircraft and sinking ships, of gunfire and drowning, of the moment when they learned that survival and victory are not the same thing as peace. The Bismarck Sea keeps its secrets, the bones of ships and men resting in the darkness, beyond the reach of light, where the only sound is the slow settling of sediment and the patient work of time. And in a small museum in Port Moresby, there is a photograph of 13 B-25 bomber crews, taken the morning of March 2, 1943, before they flew into history. If you look closely at the faces, young and confident and not yet aware of what they were about to become, you can almost see the ghosts of the future standing behind them, placing hands on shoulders, whispering the truth that war always teaches but never quite makes bearable. That courage and horror are often the same thing, separated only by which side of the gun you're standing on, and whether you survive long enough to remember.